So now we have been in Europe and we go to Asia, come back to Asia, because the next speaker, Stefen Chow, he's from Singapore. He is the co-founder of the Poverty Line. He is a landscape and portrait photographer based in Beijing. He has experience in mechanical engineering and high-altitude mountaineering, very different things. He has photographed in the Himalayas, the biggest industrial sites, and sit-down portraits of billionaires and dissident artists, also very different. He won a second prize for portraits in the World Press Photo 2013. He has exhibited internationally, including Museum of Art, Tbilisi in Georgia, a solo show at the Three Shadows Gallery in Beijing. His works have also been exhibited at the International Center of Photography in New York, Galerie 8 in Arles, and the Singapore Art Museum. He does long-term projects with a social consequence. Stefen is the co-founder of the Poverty Line, a global visual project that contextualizes poverty. The project was referenced by the World Bank and was presented at TED. He has been named by Nikon as one of Asia's top photographers. He won many awards, I already mentioned, but there's one special thing that even comes to it, and he has to kind of climb up here, but he has gone much higher. He summited the Mount Everest in 2005 in Nepal. Stefen, can I invite you?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, everyone. 大家好. Hello. Just a little bit about me. The past 3 days, I've been here listening as part of the audience, and I think I was really inspired by many of the individuals who have come up to speak. Right now, I think my background is in in photography. But I was a professional mountaineer for a while. I studied mechanical engineering, and so I really didn't have much of an arts background. And what you see for the next half an hour is basically the works that I've done. And I work with collaborators, but mostly what you see is really a one-man operation with a very small team behind me. So for me, I feel very fortunate that about 10 years ago, when I was 25 years old, I stood on top of Mount Everest. I did that for 3 years, where I trained for it. I represented Singapore. And I think the experience really put me in a very different perspective. Because as a mountaineer, it's about training, discipline, training. We were training 6 times a week for about 3 years. We were climbing in about 7 separate Himalayan expeditions. At the end of Everest, I realized that my role was, while I was a climber, I was also the photographer for the team. And I felt that photographing my teammates going through this journey, which is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime journey for us, I thought photography then meant something. It meant something important to me. It meant a lot to my teammates, and obviously to the audience who have never been there before. And so I thought during then that photography was something I wanted to pursue. So since then, I've been doing work in separate genres. And I also find that my passion as a photographer really stems from the fact that I'm able to find somewhat a balance between the commercial world, the mountaineering world, as well as the personal projects that I do. This is some of the editorial projects I do. This is for an assignment for Geo magazine based in Germany. And I actually followed a group of 80 Swiss scientists and volunteers to climb a 7,000-meter mountain to do the most extensive medical experiments up at extreme altitude. This is what we have to climb to get to our lab testing site. And this is basically the testing environment where we were there for 5 weeks to basically do experiments on how the human body reacts to altitude. So I wasn't the scientist, but I was very lucky to be able to witness how things are done, how things work up there, and just simply to be a witness, to see all these events and history being made. At the same time, because of my engineering background, I've always been very fascinated with industrial environments. And so I have always seen industrial environments as almost a precursor or a requirement to the world we live in today. Obviously, everything is very globalized, but without the heavy industries behind us, it is really hard to do the things we do today. This is actually a project for the Birla Group, which I've been working with in India. I've been photographing their separate industries for the last few years. And this, when I first saw this, I didn't know what it was, but it's a tissue-making machine for toilet paper. And this is one of the largest paper factories in Asia. This is a vessel which I just photographed about 2 weeks ago for one of the largest shipping lines. And at the same time, just by looking at a world which is very different, I get to meet very interesting people too. I met Ai Weiwei about 2 years ago when he was just released from house arrest shortly after he was detained by the Chinese authorities. And I was the first foreign photographer, journalist, to photograph him for the Smithsonian Magazine. This photograph eventually won the World Press Photo Award, which is based in Amsterdam, one of the most prestigious awards for news photography. And I think it was interesting how this wasn't a planned moment. But because people often ask me, it's like, what is he exactly doing? And what he was doing is he was actually taking a picture of me. Because Ai Weiwei has a habit of photographing people who come around the world to see him. And so as we were just about to change the studio set, he actually took out his camera to take a picture of me. And so this was a moment that was not planned, and it was used eventually, and I think the jury basically felt that today, for an artist like him, the smartphone is mightier than the pen, and mightier than the sword. And because this is what he uses to reach out to his people, to his Twitter followers, and so on. At the same time, I get to meet very interesting people. So this is Zhang Xing, who is the CEO of Soho, China. So she's one of the richest women in China right now. And I took the liberty to light up a Zaha Hadid building, which she commissioned. And so this building is all white, but this was a commission for Wall Street Journal, where we are doing a series of billionaires across China. And the idea is to bathe them in a very theatrical light. So we had to create everything on location. And this is, I think if you're looking up about 5 stories high. So every floor has to be lit up. I photographed Wang Jianling, who is currently China's richest man. I think his worth is about $40 billion. And I think I would be the first one to photograph him singing karaoke to me. So again, interesting insight into a man. I followed him for 4 days, where we had access into his life, and so I followed him on his meetings, on his private jets, and so on, just to get a glimpse into currently one of China's most powerful people. At the same time, I love working with developers too, and architects. And this is actually a project for a Hong Kong-based company, Sui On, and they have the project Xingtiandi in Shanghai. So what you see behind is all their projects, because they basically go to a city and they build retail space, hotels, office buildings, residential, and so on. And because we wanted to doubly make sure that everything looks busy, every single person that you see here is a hired model. It's true. What I'm going to show you next is, because I started as a photographer, but as we started doing work, we also realized that we are not just photographers, we are also visual people. Because in the past 3 days, we have a lot of interesting people come up here, talk about our stuff. And very often, everything is very visual. And so I feel that as a photographer, I'm part of the messengers to basically say what people want to talk about their work. This is a project for the Rosewood Hotel. And the Rosewood Hotel is recently in the last 2 years, acquired by a Hong Kong-based company. And so I did their advertising campaign, and we started with the Rosewood Beijing as a test. And so this is a video which I directed. Just 1 minute, have a look. Rosewood Hotel would be considered an ultra-luxury hotel segment. I think their rooms start at about $500 per night and above. And so they wanted to convey a feeling that feels more like a home for the rich and powerful. And so they really wanted to show more from the sense of details rather than to talk about big landscapes. So what I've shown you previously is basically what I do as my day job. And what I want to show you next is what I do on the site. And I spend a lot of time doing this. And I feel that it's really my own personal observations about the world. And what I find is that I often talk to people, I see places, I get very involved in different cultures. But I often look at it as a way to distill all these experiences and to churn it out through the form of photography. Because for me, I find that photography is a language. If I were to show you a sentence or a passage, I would have to translate it in different countries. But for a photograph, you don't have to translate it. If people understand the values behind it, it's understandable. And so for me, I feel that I speak photography rather than I speak English or Mandarin or Cantonese. One of my closest collaborators is my wife and my 2 children. So I recently became a new father. So our kid here is just 3 months old, even though he looks kind of big here. But my wife, Hui, is an economist by training. And so I find that we come from very different viewpoints. But then we often work on projects together. And that's when we sort of leave our day jobs and do our personal projects together. The first project that I want to share with you is the Play project. So the Play project is inspired one day when we brought our daughter back to Singapore, where we both grew up. And we started bringing her to playgrounds. And we find that when she went to a playground, she immediately knew that the world is hers. The staircases are colorful. Everything is padded. There are slides everywhere. It's not like in the adult world where doors knobs are very high and basically the staircases are quite dangerous, but not for a 19-month-old child. She knew that this was really fun for her. And since that day, I never saw playgrounds the same way again because I felt that as an adult, I feel quite detached from playgrounds because I felt that it doesn't concern me anymore. But as I look back, I also realized that as a child, when I was growing up, a lot of my risk-taking that I undertook when I was an adult also took place in the playgrounds itself. And so I started examining and say that, are playgrounds in Singapore interesting? So I went to explore it, but I wanted to do it in a slightly different way. So we decided to photograph it from the air instead. We ended up photographing 100 playgrounds from the air across Singapore, just to explore what it means. And when we started photographing, this is one of the earliest pictures that we took. And immediately we almost realized that the playgrounds, especially the ones in Singapore, is actually meant to be seen from above. Because the foam mats, the cartoons, everything seems to reveal itself as you get to a certain height. And even how the housing and the cars are placed seemed pretty interesting. And we thought that all the playgrounds in Singapore are alike, but not really. Each of them is rather unique, has a very different urban architecture, and I think it really sparked a new discovery on how playgrounds are different in Singapore. We are quite sure this was not designed by Disney, but you can be sure to see Mickey Mouse just right there. And even this image. So this is actually in Choa Chu Kang. When you talk about Choa Chu Kang, most Singaporeans will say, oh, that's actually quite far away because it's away from the city center. But what we did was to re-explore what the playgrounds meant. And since then, this has been picked up by the National Geographic, Time magazine. I spoke at a TEDx talk in Kyoto about this. This had about 5 million impressions that we have created. So basically, we shifted the conversation from Singapore being a very first world country with first world infrastructure, which it has, to maybe something in the heartlands, where you talk about something as detailed as the playground itself. The second project that I wanted to show you is perhaps my longest form project that we've done so far, the poverty line. I get very inspired by this quotation. In a country well governed, poverty is something to be ashamed of. You will expect that this quotation comes from a modern politician, someone who lives in our time. This quote is actually attributed to Kongzi, Confucius, who lived 2,500 years ago. He's one of China's most foremost important philosophers, but he lived 2,500 years ago, which means that if his quote still rings true today, there are some problems that we have not solved for a long time. What inspired us to do the Poverty Line project was the fact that I was traveling a lot as a photographer. And people talk about how perhaps in the developed world, things are okay, whereas in the developing world, there are problems. But I remember during my first trip to New York, what I realized is instead of the glitz and glamour in Wall Street or Times Square, I saw homeless people just outside Wall Street. At night, if you take the subway home, you'll find the homeless people putting up cardboard boxes onto the seats itself so that they can sleep on the train during the night because the trains actually move 24 hours, unlike the MTR trains in Hong Kong. Within the same week, I found myself in Kolkata, in India. As we were driving towards the city from the airport, I realized that that left lane of the road is actually paved with sleeping poor people. I asked the driver, why is this so? Why am I seeing so many poor people sleeping on the lane? And he replied, because they couldn't sleep outside buildings, because that is private property. So they can actually sleep on the road, because that's considered public. So it really occurred to me, if poverty is a better situation to be in New York or Calcutta, and it's kind of hard to answer that. So we decided to look at poverty as a situation. And we discovered that poverty line is an economic definition used by a lot of countries. And when we started this project, we found that in China, back in 2010, if you're at the poverty line, you'll be spending 3.28 yuan a day a person for food. What it means is about 50 cents US dollars, which is just about maybe 4 Hong Kong dollars. I remember that amount was incredibly little because I was spending far more just buying a coffee at Starbucks. But nevertheless, I went to the markets to find what I can get for 3.28 yuan. You can get some things. You can get 6 buns. You can also get some vegetables. And you can get a bit of meat. This is what you get in a single day for one person if you're poor in China in 2010. It wasn't a lot, but it was a bit more than what I expected because in my middle-class, comfortable life, I thought 3.28 yuan is not something I would think about. And so, since then, we started this project back in 2010. We decided to expand the project a bit more. I'm going to show you our website, which is thepovertyline.net. So what you see here is you go inside the website. We have since photographed in 28 countries across 6 continents. Every country's poverty line is different because we use the nationally derived statistics. And if you go into Thailand, you can see that we photograph about close to 100 food items in every place. So it gives you a sense of what it means to be poor just based on food choices. And if you zoom in, you can see sweets that you can get in one day if you're poor. And if you are more interested, the statistics and research is done behind. And you can click in to see other countries. This is UK, where in UK it's about $9.40 US. Again, you can go in, take a look closer, look at the meatloaf, read the statistics on the research on how it's done. And then we believe that poverty can also be interactive. So what we did is you can actually combine different countries just to compare the poverty lines in different countries, just to get a sense. Even look at carbohydrates, look at the breads on different countries, and look at different countries again. We divided them into developed and developing countries because in economic terms, they are rather different. And you can look at meat and just to compare. So this is a project and so on. I think this is Mauritius. So since we started this project, we have been to many countries. We have been to many markets. We also realized that the whole visual element is pretty much set 5 years ago, where we photograph food on newspapers. And we actually have a rule with using the newspapers. First of all, it has to be photographed. The newspapers have to be bought on the day of the shoot itself. So it locks in the time. And also, it has to be a local paper. So when you look at this, because it's really hard to tell if the tomatoes are from Spain or from Hong Kong or from India. But if you look at the newspapers behind, you get a sense of where this might come from. And even through this, as single images, you'll find a lot to understand about the country's culture, politics, and the psyche of the society. This is in the US, where truthfully, you can actually get a lobster at the poverty line. It is surprising for me, but you can actually get it in Chinatown in New York at Canal Street. And for $4.91 US, this is what you get. In Netherlands, you realize that orange is a national obsession. So even their advertisements itself is orange, and even everything is pretty much orange, which is really interesting, things that you find out when you open the newspapers in a country. In Madagascar, this was photographed back in 2011, and when we were flipping the papers, we realized that this young man is in almost every single page of every paper that we bought. And later we found out that they overtook the previous government through a military coup. He was 28 years old when he became president. And the country basically descended into chaos because the international community would not recognize it. So since then, the government has transited to a more democratic one, but it is still in a lot of trouble. But what it means is when you look at this image today, especially for the Madagascans, this would be considered history. In UAE, when we did the project, again, the paper itself suggests its attitude towards globalization on how pop stars can appear beside a very conservative local culture itself. Even in Norway, I found this advertisement rather interesting because I think in Asia this would have been very controversial. This is an ad put up by the Norwegian Oil Fund, and it says, "Where others see only jungle, we see profit." And it actually talks about a mining project that they're doing in South America. And in the final words, it actually says that when all the resources are gone, you can trust us because we still have the resources. Something along that line. Even in Hong Kong, when we photographed this in 2011, I remember the day before when we arrived at our hotel, we actually had to join the protesters because that was the only way to get to our hotel. And I think this is also a precursor of what has happened to the country since, where when you talk about equality or if you talk about problems, there is often a view that is very opposing on different sides. And I think when we did the poverty line, we expected it to be a very simple work, but I think it has triggered far more conversations. So since the poverty line, we have done this quite a bit. Just to let you know, it's really my wife and I. We have a manager helping us, so we are a really small team, but we have gotten quite a bit of coverage. And we got a 8-page feature on Le Monde, which I thought was the first time for a photographer based outside of Europe. And BBC followed us to do marketing in the markets of Beijing. And we have also since expanded this into an open call project where we ask people of the public to do something similar to the poverty line so they can experience what poverty line means in their own country. This is working with the Taida students, which is the Taiwan National University, where we work with 50 of them to photograph the poverty line using our methods. And this is a picture that's taken by a 15-year-old student with her thoughts over here. Her post alone generated more than 100 likes on her social media, which was really interesting because I think that was our bottom line. We wanted to increase conversation surrounding this topic itself. This was an opening that we did in Beijing about 3 years ago. And this is a current exhibition that is still on in Paris right now, where this is a 180-piece installation representing 6 continents. This is at the Kafa Museum in Beijing, which is a 100-meter wall installation. And right now, if you're in Hong Kong, the show is currently at the 5th floor of the PMQ. So right now, I know the official closing date is this Sunday. So if you have time, you should go and check it out, where we install our entire archive from 28 countries. So it's about 3,000 pictures pasted from bottom to top. So to give you a very immersive sense of what it means. So we basically pasted around the building of the PMQ itself. It took us a bit of negotiations, but eventually it's there, and I think it looks absolutely beautiful. So I think you should catch it before it's gone. The next project that I wanted to share with you is we have been working on the poverty line for 5 years. And so we started realizing that there are ideas that we have come and done, and we wanted to do it in a different way. So I was actually approached by a festival in Paris, and they gave me a 20 euro budget to do whatever I want. So what I did was I took the 20 euros, I split them into 10 euros and 10 euros. I converted them into renminbi. And I realized that with 10 euros, I could get buns, mantos, multiples of them, and I could find 100 of them. And then with the other 10 euros, I could go to a market called Panjiayuan, and I found a gold-plated jewelry smith who was weighing his jewelry by the milligram. And so we measured exactly the point where it was 10 euros worth. And then I created a collage where its equivalence, number one, where 100 mantos that you see over here is equivalent to the cost of the gold-plated pendant just over here. It talks about equality, it talks about needs, and it talks about wants. This was showcased at the festival in Paris itself, and since then we have expanded it a little. In Japan, I did something similar, where I find what I can get with ramen, and I equate it to an iPhone cable, and the cost of it all. And again, I did a collage, and I find that you can buy approximately 100 ramen to equate the cost of an iPhone cable. To most people in the developed world, an iPhone cable is perhaps one of the most important things in their life. But so is ramen to a person who's struggling to feed his stomach. So again, it talks about equivalence. This is another project that we did where it questions, again, the morality of the world we live in today, where I read that a vitamin pill is worth a lot of oranges. So much so that the only way that you look at an orange is due to its vitamin C, And the way you look at a pill is due to the nutrients itself. So we realized that one pill over there is equivalent to 15 oranges. Is that right? Or is that not right? So again, a project that explores that. The last project I want to share with you is a project that I started working on this year. And it's really about the observations of what is happening to our world, and also my own basis as a news photographer, because that's how I started in this career. And it's called 大城小事, or Big City, Small Things. I'll give you a moment to just read the artistic statement. But basically, it talks about how the butterfly effect. Today, when we read the news or when we get news updates on the social media, we get affected by events that happens to us thousands of miles away. The ISIS, the terrorists, basically uses that mentality to affect societies. If big news can change history, what about small news? And that is my focus. So in every big city, I explore what small news happen in those places, and I go to these sites and I re-photograph them to see what I can find. So what you're going to see next is a picture followed by the summary of the news that just happened. This is in Beijing. So these are actual news events that happen, and I go back and photograph them. The next one is in London. This is the shot. I believe someone spoke about the shot this morning. This is Paris. And basically, I play with the fact that when you see the image, it gives you one emotion. But when you see the event that has happened, there is an emotional shift. And what I'm trying to grapple with is the emotional shift and what is news doing to us. This is Paris as well. This was actually about 2 weeks before the bombing happened. This is Tokyo. This is in LA. And this is New York. So, in a nutshell, I hope that was a glimpse into what I do. Once again, I feel that photography is my language, and I hope that I'm able to juggle this as long as I can, to be able to do both commercial work, editorial work, and also personal work, which I hope can provoke more discussions and conversations. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Steven. Thanks for reminding a Dutch person that the color of orange is so important. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to go and see your work still in PMQ.
Yes.
Until Sunday.
Until Sunday, yeah.
So please take your chances. I want to ask you a few questions.
Yeah.
One starting with the going back to your preparations in going into the Himalaya.
Mm-hmm.
As a photographer, to really take good pictures, do you need a similar amount of preparation?
I think you actually need a bit more. Because what happens is when we are preparing for our expedition, most of us will be concerned with the climbing logistics. Mm-hmm. And I typically carry about 20 kilos of camera gear on me. And you figure out a way to do it. And you start stripping it down for certain portions. And so I typically carry between 5 to 10 kilos more than my teammates. Mm-hmm. And I often have to pace myself so that I can be in front or behind them. So it's a bit more work, but it's interesting.
That similar kind of preparation, if you want to take good pictures of famous people, that is also not just taking a picture. There's all the preparation, anticipating what may happen, and making sure that you have everything well prepared.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when I work with very high-profile people,
Yeah.
very often they might tell you, okay, we'll give you half an hour.
Yeah.
But when it starts, they are late, and by the time they arrive, they say you have 5 minutes. So I think the whole idea is to prepare as much as you can, but then once you're on set, you expect anything that might happen wrong.
I think we're grateful that you don't have any fear of heights. That's why we saw these beautiful pictures that you took from the heights onto the playgrounds. But there's also one question that I want to ask you about your career development. In fact, climbing, taking pictures, to doing these projects like the poverty line and the ones that came after. In fact, it's not just taking pictures anymore. You've become like a bookmaker, or are you a curator of your own work? So what is the progression in your career? How do you see yourself?
I think it's hard to define. In the end, I would just say I'm just a photographer.
Yeah.
But I think the definition of photographer has also changed in today's time and age. So I think we are more like storytellers, because more and more we live in a world where we communicate using pictures. And I believe that effective photography tells effective stories.
Yeah.
And so essentially that's what I do, whether it is in book form, whether it's online. I think in the end it's the overall experience that I want to convey to the audience.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Please give him an applause, Stefen. Thanks a lot. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.